Hello there, my name is Juliana. I'm a first year PhD student in sociology, doing studies in distributed cognitive systems in society at large. So I'm not only looking at the technology, but I'm also looking at human society as part of the distributed cognitive system in the conception of hybrid cognition and cybernetics organisms. Now, I need to make sure that this message is through in the sense of these recordings that I'm posting on YouTube. They are material for my own research, and these are really brainstorming sessions. They're not structured. I'm not thinking too much ahead of time. I might make mistakes. I've gone back to a couple of them, and I hear all sorts of, especially English mistakes. But yeah, so I do apologize about that, but I'm not concerned about this. This is really so that I get the ideas out of my mind into some sort of medium that I can come back to it later and ponder on my reasoning about these ideas that I come across. So why not share some of my research in the literature, in my understanding of the some of the works in the literature through YouTube, right? I think that might be somebody might find this helpful as well. So please, I do apologize. Don't take me so seriously in these recordings. Take them as is. It's not a, yeah, you understand the message, right? So in this particular recording, I'm gonna have to have several different sessions because this is a book that's very complex, and I'm very passionate about this book, so I might discuss a lot of the ideas. There are so many ideas packed up in this book. So yeah, it's not going to be like a one take kind of thing because I don't think I can explore the ideas in this book very, let's say, so productively if I do that. So I'm just going to record my ideas as I read the book. I've read some of the chapters already, but I'm going back and then exploring them again and recording my ideas. I've taken already some notes, but I'm going back and doing this as a recording. So I hope you enjoy. This is Autonomous Technology, Techniques Out of Control as a Theme in Political Thought. This was published in 1978 by Langdon Winner. And this is a bit of a finding. I like to put it this way because this is not this is not a famous book, right? It did not get the level of attention that I believe it deserves. And I'm going to explain this very quickly, or why I think that is, right? It was published by the MIT Press, so very significant publication. To my understanding, I like the writing. I like the ideas that are in here. Langdon Winner was writing about, artificial intelligence and autonomous technology and the like. We're going to explore his concepts of technology in the book, but he was writing about this in 1970s, in the 70s, right? So let's say that technology in the 70s were not the technology that we understand today. So he was really thinking ahead of his time. It was really I'm really impressed with the fact that he was thinking of autonomous technology in the level and the kind of in the dimension of impact that this kind of technology will have in society at large. So yeah, I do think that this is a significant work, and I'm always recommending it. So the reason why I think Langdon Winner did not get that much of attention, there are two of his publications that I like. One is this book, and another one is from 1980, where he asks, does technology have politics, like artifacts? Actually, he says, well, do artifacts have politics? So it's about in the same line of this book, but he does some case studies of infrastructure, if building the systems, the technical systems or technological systems, if they have politics embedded in them. So I really like his line of thinking. It is essential for my research as well. So this is going to be a good um, good book for those interested in social technical systems. And this book belongs to a class of theoretical understanding that I am now starting to call social technical theory. I don't understand if people are pushing forward the idea that there is a social technical theory, because of course we have a social theory, but in Winner's work, he will refer to the social technical system. He will use the term social technical system. So this is a fantastic literature for my research here. I'm going back to it. I have been going back to it. This is about the third time that I'm going to be paying attention to in detail to some of the writings in the book. There's a chapter that I'm particularly fond of, which is chapter 8. It's the closing chapter of the book, but it's called Frankenstein's Problem. It's if you want to read anything of this book and you do not want to touch everything of it, I do recommend chapter 8. But yeah, let's go ahead and start speaking about why I think that Langdon Winner did not get as much attention. And I don't think that that was I wouldn't say fair, but yeah, I think he should have gotten more attention, and I'm giving all the attention to his work because I think it's so interesting. So he published this material in the 70s, so 1978, and Winner has the same kind of thinking as Foucault. Michel Foucault. So for those who are not familiar with the work of Michel Foucault, he's writing about technologies of the self and biopolitics, and he's pretty much trying to draw an understanding of the relationship between technology and power, so knowledge and power, and how that changes power relations in society. And then, while to him, well, technology is regulation, right? And it's the same line of thinking that Winner has in his book. But I think that Winner goes more into some of the questions of understanding what technology is, and how it changes society, and how that regulation takes place. This is very similar, well, to Foucault. So yeah, it's a good comparison between Winner and Foucault to understand this topic. So super productive reading here. Let's get into my take into the introduction. There are a few core points. Yeah, another one is like Winner is the pre-feminist. So there are these three lines of thinking of technology as this having regulatory agency or political agency, and at least the ones I look at. And those are Winner, Foucault, and then the feminist technoscience, right? You will have, for example, Donna Haraway, who wrote the Cyborg Manifesto, which is totally a sort of a political statement against the military and masculine aggressiveness that drives technological development, or at least that it did during the war periods of the 20th century, and that was very fundamental to I wouldn't say fundamental, but that promoted these sort of scholarship towards trying to understand the politics of technological systems, of technology and knowledge, right? In the World War II, for example, you had the case of nuclear technology and how powerfully, how would I say this? Like how destructive that kind of technology can be. And the sort of interest that governments had to have a hold, of technology, so that they would be in advantage of their adversaries, in like the state of war and so on. So this brought the attention to the fact that technologies were gaining significant political agency, right? And so a lot of the studies went into trying to understand that, and these three lines of of thinking that I would say, well, Marcuse in the 50s, then I could say four because of Marcuse, but Marcuse was very objective in saying, well, technology is a dominant force in society, right? He said, well, technological rationality is totalitarian and it's a dominant force in society. And then from that, it's like sort of sprawled into a lot of the studies. And this is pretty much what Winner say in the introduction, that before that, technology was left, to the technicians because it was a bit of politely ignored by the other sciences. But then after the understanding that they became increasingly holding technology became increasingly significant to the question of power, and how that could impact society at large, then other sciences started gaining a lot more interest into understanding this kind of impact of technology in the larger framework of social organization. But Winner will say, he will point to the fact that, well, technological change or advanced technological societies is not something new. So it's not something that's being lived by contemporary civilization. And that has happened a lot in the past, when you have like significant technological shifts in technological in the ability of developing technologies, in the advance of technology in certain societies, then he says that triggers some kind of political shift as well. So he says, well, the technical innovation is not something exclusive of industrial and post-industrial society. That has happened a lot of times in the past, and that political change is somehow a response to that kind of technological advancement. Now, this is a very good point, because if we go back to the 80s, in the 80s and 90s, we would find certain scholars who worked in trying to understand how technological advancement is shifting power relations in the international system, right? In the international economy, in global order and so on. So I've studied a few of them. So you would go back to Keohane, Joseph Nye, and Susan Strange. They wrote very important literature in the area, in the discipline of international relations. And this is what we refer to the complex interdependence theory. And they will say, well, with the advancement of information and communication technologies, we saw this kind of diffusion of power through the international system, right? Whereas before, only the states, the large, nation states, could afford having communication across large geographical distances. They would only the large players could have access to, satellite communication and all of these communication systems, because they were so expensive. Once the prices of technology started lowering, then more people starting to have, and more institutions and more organizations started to have access to these kind of technologies. And with that, a lot more players started to get into the debate, right? Into the political debate. So that diffused power into from it sort of took away power from the states a little bit and diffused that throughout society. So this is the complex interdependence theory. So when Winner is pointing to the fact that advancement in technologies trigger change in political structures in society. In our contemporary context, these are scholars that are tackling these problems. Okay, so this is yeah, one way of looking at how technological change triggers, political change in contemporary society. So Winner goes very deeply into trying to define technology, what we understand by technology, and techniques. So he sort of distinguishes physical technical devices as apparatuses. So the apparatus, technological apparatus, is the physical device, the physical technology. And then technical skills, he refers to those as techniques. And organization as social arrangements, and then networks as large scale systems that link people and apparatuses, so it's the physical technology, across distances. He makes this distinguish very clear, and he says, well, because the notion of technology has become so broad that it has sort of lost a bit of the meaning, because then we can't really understand exactly what we are talking about once we're talking about technology, right? So he makes that distinguish very clear, and he goes back to the work of some very fundamental thinkers in the social technical theory, and that would be Ellul, Jacques Ellul, and Mumford. He also goes back to the work of Mumford. Those are writers of things like the technological system. Let me see here. I have that written down. Yeah, Jacques Ellul wrote the technological system, and Mumford wrote a couple of more. I have to go back and look at them. But yeah, so he draws a lot of his work on the ideas of Ellul and Mumford. Those are also very interesting. They should show up somewhere, sometime in my channel as well. Down the line. So this is the introduction. He pretty much just kind of sets up the stage of what he is going to be talking about. So I think that the main points were this: how technological advancement triggers political change, makes a distinction between technology and techniques, right? So how we should understand technology, and points to the fact that before, not a lot of attention was paid to how technology has this sort of political significance in society, right? So let me move on to chapter 1. All right, so some of my observations in chapter 1 are going to be recorded in different times. I don't know how well this is going to work for those who are listening, but for me it makes a bit more sense. Like, as I read it, my mind just goes wild with like linking the ideas that he is proposing, his arguments, and the quotes that he uses, in linking these with other quotes and my own idea. So because this is the purpose of these audios, I'm going to try to do this in this book. So in chapter 1, this is autonomy and mastery. So he is exploring the idea that technology itself has become autonomous in the way that it has gotten out of control by human agency, so that humans no longer sort of define the fate of our technological systems, but that the techno structure in itself has reached a level of autonomy, a state of autonomy. So this is pretty much his central argument in this book, and he goes back to the ideas of Ellul, that I've mentioned before, and some other authors, bringing to this like huge concern that technology is out of human hands now. That and that this fact has now gained some considerable public attention. Now, my idea here would be, well, he comes to say that the concept of autonomous technology to him is like all of the conceptions and observations to the fact that technology is somehow out of control of human agency, right? That the techno structure, he uses the term techno structure, but then in my last recording, I used the term the technosphere, right? Because this is the term that the authors used in that other text. And it seems to me to be making the same sort of um, uh, indication here, the technostructure, the technosphere. So what Winner is pointing here is that how this structure, this sphere, has gotten out of the control of human agency and has somehow its own is now seeking its own self-realization. Now, there's one thing about my research is that we have the idea that this thing is like separate from us, and this is contradicting. Maybe if we look at the entire book, we're going to see how it comes together on this notion. But the thing is, like, the feminist technoscience, what it is sort of proposing is that we break down this boundary between humans and machines, right? So it's not like we can look at the technosphere or the technostructure as this artifact that is separate from human beings. Now, the proposal of post-humanism is that we look at it as some kind of extension of human agency. And for example, artificial intelligence, the way that I am proposing that we look at artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence and super intelligence and so on, is that this is the sort of extension of human cognitive capability. And if you go back to the cybernetics movement, which is, the intellectual movement that pushed to the development of computing, information and computing technology, pretty much, we realized that it was never intended to be this sort of movement that creates an artifact. The curiosity, the intellectual trigger of that movement was the curiosity to understand the functionings of the brain. So it started off as this idea of how does the brain function, and because of the notion of homeostasis, which is the exchange between body information between body and environment, for the stabilization of that relation, allowed for us to understand the way the information flows through different materials, right? So from the human organism to, or biological organism to technological artifact. So in his book, Winner, in this idea that is just an extension, he will make a consideration here on page 13 that will say, he's actually he's quoting here. Let me see who he's quoting from. He's quoting from, sorry about that, Heisenberg in his book Physics and Philosophy of 1958. And he says that Heisenberg will say that the more modern means of communication and traffic completed a kind of progress of expansion of technical civilization, but that this technical structure can be considered, this sort of expansion, the process of expansion, can be considered as a biological process on the largest scale, right? So at a very large scale, you see the processes happening towards the advancement of technology as this sort of large scale phenomenon that happens within the biological realm. And then he says, well, we may consider this expansion as a biological process on the largest scale whereby the structures active in the human organism encroach on larger parts of matter and transform it into a state suited for the increasing human population. Well, I wouldn't go as far that it's the purpose of the biological process would be particularly devoted to suit the needs for an increasing human population, right? Because if we are thinking that this is a larger, that technological advancement is a phenomenon that happens at a larger scale in a biological context, like the article that we saw, that I read in the last video, that's called Planetary Intelligence. I don't think that that would be just for the purpose of serving human population, but I do agree that the technical structure, or the technical sphere, the technosphere, is the sort of extension of biological agency. So in this, I agree. And then if we are speaking of how technology acquires a kind of autonomy, then it could be in the sense that the larger scale organization has an agency in the sense that it becomes a system of its own, right? The complex adaptive system that the last article on planetary scale intelligence was arguing for. We're saying, well, the globe, the planet, at the planetary scale, the technosphere, along, interconnected with all the other systems in the globe, that means the biological systems, the biosphere, and so on, they all become this one larger scale system made of the subsystems, and that the agency that is displayed in that larger system is an emergent phenomenon of the lower level phenomenon. So the interaction that happens at the lower level of organization, it interacts in a way that creates the sort of new agency. So I do agree that this technosphere might have an agency of its own, and this is sort of my proposal, right? Because you would have like a collective performance, and the emergence and the kind of behavior that it displays is a collective behavior. But I would disagree that this is like disconnected from human agency, because human agency would be a lower level agency of the larger scale phenomenon, right? So this is a good point to add in explaining the sort of differences between an immature technological civilization to like a matured, technological civilization. And I'm gonna have a bit of a problem trying to connect these audios, but I hope they work. And then one might think, okay, then what is autonomy? Like, what is autonomy in the sense of this technosphere becoming an autonomous agent? And he will offer the concept of autonomy, of the concept of autonomous on page 16. And you say, well, that the autonomy, the word autonomy brings a sort of a conception that is a conception that brings together the ideas of freedom and control, but that to be autonomous is to be self-governing, independent, not ruled by an external law or force. So here, the idea of like control, that there's no control, is strong, and we would have to look at the concept of autonomous a bit further. Now, he will explore the idea of autonomy in the thought of Immanuel Kant, in the metaphysics of Immanuel Kant, saying that autonomy refers to the fundamental condition of free will, right? The capacity of the will to follow moral laws, which it gives to itself. So this is still on page 16. It all belongs to the same sort of quote area here in the text. But then if you think of the fact that a body of like an organization, an organism, is a phenomenon that emerges out of the interaction of lower levels of organization, then you would see that this autonomy of the higher level system is made out of the interaction of the lower level systems, and it is not independent of it. So this is very conflicting in the sense of thinking that something at large scale would be autonomous in the sense that decisions cannot be made by the lower level system. This is very political, because if we are thinking of the international system and the global system, wouldn't you think that governance, the way that governance is practiced, for example, is an effect, is an emergent phenomenon of the lower level interaction. So when you have control over the lower level interactions, then that is problematic. And perhaps this here is a very critical point that needs a lot of clarification. So how does autonomy play in the sense that lower level interaction or lower level organization interacting form the larger scale system, and then the autonomy displayed in the large scale system is an emergent phenomenon of the lower level interaction. So it's not separate from it. It's not independent of the interaction at the lower level. This is very important and very fundamental in the context of understanding how is the larger scale system autonomous. Yeah, so here on page 17, he will point to the fact that you have like these two different understandings of technology out of control, that one of them, some of the views are focused on the process of change in which society is progressively transformed and incorporated by an expanding scientific technology, and how technology out of control is contextualized by that transformation and by that process of change. And then in the other kind of perception over technology out of control, the idea focuses on the behavior of a large scale system that appears to operate and grow through a process of self-generation beyond human intervention. This is on page 17. So my focus here, I'm more on the second, although the politics of technological change lies within the first option, because you have the sort of transformation of political structure due to the process of technological change. And then on the second view of technology out of control, then you have that sort of large scale system that appears to operate on its own, that it's autonomous, self-generating, and self-regulating. The core of the argument for my thesis would be the second one, that the large scale system is autonomous and has its own self-regulatory system. And this self-regulation is based on the cognitive interactions between humans and machines. I would go as far as saying between organic matter and not organic matter, but biological organization and the technological system, right? So you have human-machine cognitive interaction, and that regulates the sociotechnical system. But then that kind of structure, that structure in itself changes political structure. So this is a sort of compiled perception of technology out of control. Although I'm not saying out of control, because yeah, I've already argued this before. You have the autonomous that's self-governing and everything. So the important point here is the core argument is complex adaptive systems. The sociotechnical system behaves as a complex adaptive system, but then that implies major change in the political organization. Well, here in chapter 2, he will make some very critical questions in the sense of trying to understand the question of autonomy and mastery in the context of the ontology of power and control, because he is going to criticize the fact that Western thinking has been built on this idea of control and manipulation, right? Of scientific knowledge and how that can be achieved. Well, how control can be achieved through technology. But he does criticize that not all of the communities do believe that the mode of knowing has to be through technology. So he says here on page 19 that the conclusion that something is out of control is interesting only if we expect that it ought to be in control in the first place, because not all cultures share Western thinking that the ability to control things is necessary to human survival. And this is interesting in the context of criticizing that this is what is called Western thinking, right? Because if you think of colonization of the Americas, for instance, you will find that the native indigenous communities in Native America before the colonization period, a lot of their belief was based on the idea of the subjectivity in the world, right? So this shifted once. I've written this before in an article about using the example of the colonization of Brazil, for instance, and the Spanish-speaking America in general. Colonizers came in and then they imposed their modes of knowing, their modes of governance, and their ways of living. They imposed that onto the native indigenous community. And if the indigenous communities did not want to follow that sort of way of living, then they would be either, slaved or killed. So there was a lot of imposition of this kind of rational thinking during the colonization process. So there's a sort of a double criticism here in the way that not all cultures think in the way that the Western thinking goes, in the way of control, like that man is a dominant force over nature, right? But then there's a criticism that this is not his, right? This is my criticism saying, well, this is also not Western thinking. It's probably more European or Eurocentral. Yeah, Eurocentral thinking. But this is a very long discussion in anthropology that I think it's not worth getting into. But he does mention this. Some of the critical questions that he will make go from it starts on page 28 here, 27. So how thoroughly do people know their own technology? So this is the question of mastery, and saying that as technological systems increase in size and complexity, the less you will have people mastering the technology, because now specialists, they know the small pieces of how these large scale technological systems work. They're not very familiar with the way that the systems work as a whole, at least not most of the technicians, right? They control or they manage or they build specific parts of much larger systems. So to him, this is a way of showing that, well, listen, mastery is not, following the advancement of technology. So then he asks, well, to what extent do men control technology? And he points to the fact that as these large-scale systems expand and develop, such as communication networks, he uses freeways, weapon systems, uh, power networks and so on, they they expand in such a way that their technological advancement have certain impacts in society that are in nature that are actually unintended and uncontrolled. So these consequences in themselves are uncontrolled and unintended, and that points to the fact that, well, there's not so much control in technology. So then he observes here on page 28, while the same technologies that have extended men's control over the world are themselves difficult to control. And this is something that you will see if you hear technicians speaking about artificial intelligence. They will say that a lot of what happens, a lot of times, certain things happen that they cannot foresee. This is an example that I always use. So Ben Gortzel is explaining, for example, how Sophia, the one of the most advanced humanoids, Ben Gortzel is the chief scientist who helped program the open cog architecture, which is the it's what makes Sophia and the other robots that are connected to the system function. And he says, well, sometimes Sophia will say things that I don't really know how she came up with it. And she said, and he says, well, and I'm the chief scientist. So this is the kind of practical example of how technicians do not understand what's going on in the systems that they program themselves. Oh, wow, this chapter is very powerful. He now is speaking about how man lives in and through technical creations. He's talking about technological animism, and how technologies have a life of its own, but then how he uses certain examples in the literature, how the idea is that man, the creator, transfer his own life into the machine. But then he uses this one literature called The Machine Stops. And it's the story, I think I have to go back to this one here. But it's a story that was written in 1920 by Foster, E.M. Foster, that there's a civilization living really far beneath the surface of the earth, and that is completely dependent on a large beneficent machine, that it's perfect, and that people living underneath the surface of the earth is actually keeping the machine alive. But then they lost all their agency, except of the agency for keeping this machine alive. And then one young person is discontent with that, perceives what is happening, and then he crawls through one of the machine's vomitories, which is quite a creepy. But then it discovers that above, the land above is super beautiful, and that people do not have to rely on the machine to breathe, for example, because in the situation there, the machine clears the air. It's not, people don't go somewhere else to get clean air. The air where they are in is cleaned by the machine. But then this guy realizes that the surface is beautiful, it's very livable, and then he comes back and tell the people about what he found there, and says, well, we exist only as the blood corpuscles that course through its arteries, and if it could work without us, it would let us die. It's so impressive. But then it says, well, the life of the whole society is transferred into the mechanism. yeah, and then that the price for the services that the machine give to the people is that human beings can no longer have any direct relationship with each other and with the world. Everything must go through the technical intermediary. And here something is always lost. Now this is very impressive because it just brought me to the whole idea of this global pandemic that we're now having our whole lives done through the computer, right? We always have conference calls and so on. Now that the pandemic is sort of ending in certain places, this is diminishing. But essentially, we lived through periods where everything we would do would be through technology as an intermediary. And then he goes back to how Karl Marx had already sort of depicted the industrial complex as this sort of automaton that is a mechanism that works on its own. Yeah, and so this book is super. It gets you really some intense thinking. So this is yeah, this brought me to the fact that we do everything through technology now. Yeah, he cites Marx on page 36. It says, an organized system of machines to which motion is communicated by the transmitting mechanism from a central automaton is the most developed form of production machinery. This brought me to thinking about, how we're thinking of AGI and super intelligence and how artificial intelligence is going to be like the main form of life. And this is something that's, yeah, it's terrible to cite Marx and anything. It feels a bit strange because people are so negative towards Marxism. But there are, most people who are like that. They've never even read Marx, but I not that I agree with everything that Marx says, but some of the things he says are really impacting and powerful because of, including for the fact of the time that he was writing these things. And here he's only really pointing to how Marx was explaining how humans became the sort of appendages to the mechanical monster. He uses the word monster, but the mechanical apparatus of the factories. So humans are only this sort of appendage helping the factory run. Another citation that he makes from Marx in manuscripts is that the more the worker expends himself in work, the more powerful becomes the world of objects which he creates in face of himself. This is totally speaking of like the expansion of artificial intelligence, of technological cognitive systems, right? Because the more we expend those systems, the more it controls our own behavior. So this is a point that's interesting to sort of explore, if I want to explore, or if anybody wants to explore the notion of, yeah, sort of expansion of self through the technological apparatus and how that comes back to sort of regulate, yeah, our own behavior. Yeah, and I think that this could be used here. But I'm not sure I want to explore Marx's idea because I think has been overexplored, especially because I think that all Marxists, most Marxists, they're very negative. Marxism is a very negative take on technology in any, at least in the works that I've had, except there's a recording of Marcuse's lecture where he speaks of young Marx writing on aesthetic sensibility, and he speaks of the way that men would like regain touch with other modes of knowing through our sensory system. So like nature, touch, no sense of smell. That knowing is not only scientific knowledge or technological rationality, but also through our bodily senses. We know through the sensory system as well. So, as Marcuse puts it, it's called by Marx aesthetic sensibility. This is a very positive on the way that regaining this sort of touch with other ways, other modes of knowing that are more sensorial, would sort of revolutionize, the way that we think today. So this is a positive take on Marxism. But other than that, it's all most of them are very negative towards, technology and so on. There is a little bit of a recognition in Marcuse, in one-dimensional men, that he's criticizing, well, this is technological rationality is the sort of dominant force, but he says, well, we cannot sort of ignore the achievements that technological rationality has allowed us to conquer. So yeah, I think that having a more of a balanced take would be important, especially based on the article on planetary intelligence, how it says, well, we have an immature technosphere, Anthropocene, and so on, and then we have a sort of a mature technosphere, which we now transition from this immature to a mature technosphere, where in the immature stage, you would have some unintended consequences of technological advancement. So I think Marx is really emphasizing the sort of unintended consequences, or yeah, so not that it is all unintended, of course. The dominant force would be an unintended consequence of technological rationality, but it would only appear in this stage of immature technosphere. And just to sort of wrap up this chapter here, he goes to the work of Jacques Ellul in the Technological Society. And then he mentions that technique, that the thesis in Ellul's work is that technique is entirely anthropomorphic because human beings have become thoroughly technomorphic. That man has invested his life in a mass of methods, techniques, machines, rational productive organizations, and network. And that all of this must now move in unison, or both will perish. This is super interesting. This is, I've just read this from page 42. And then he just explains how the other chapters will follow. But this is it. I think that I'm going to make this part one of this book. This is a very complex, very intense reading. I cannot do justice for this work. I'd have to read it several times for for a very long period of time to be able to give a good analysis of this work. But just the sort of brainstorming helps to build my understanding of this work through further readings.